My name is Mel. I'm the marketing director here at Medcurity. I'm here with Jordan Scherich. She's our lead business analyst. She'll be presenting today. Just a few housekeeping notes. We will have a Q&A at the end, and you can post your questions into the chat or in the Q&A. I'll see them either way. But for the most part, we'll be holding questions until the end. And without further ado, I will hand things off to Jordan. Thanks, Jordan.
All right. Thanks, Mel, for the introduction. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited about this session because everyone here already knows that HIPAA isn't a checkbox. We hear that cliche often. You registered for this webinar because you care about doing things right and not just meeting the minimum requirements. So the title itself really comes from the common theme that we hear all the time, that compliance can feel like a moving target and with conflicting advice or too much noise. So today we're really going to strip that noise away and focus on what really matters. And that's what the OCR actually expects from covered entities and business associates for 2025 and what's worth your time and what's not. So I'm going to go ahead and keep this conversational, a little fun, and focus on practical, real-world takeaways so you can use it right away. So before we dive into regulations, I'm going to give a little bit of context about who we are and what we do, because it really shapes how we approach HIPAA. So at Medcurity, we work exclusively in healthcare compliance and cybersecurity. That's what we do all day, every day. We partner with hospitals, clinics, community health centers, and specialty practices, along with business associates across the country to make HIPAA compliance manageable, organized, and audit ready. Our work covers everything from the security risk analysis and business associate reviews to policy development, staff training, and ongoing risk management. So in short, we help organizations simplify the process by translating federal regulations into everyday actions that make sense to real people who are busy taking care of patients. We know that HIPAA can feel like alphabet soup sometimes. The OCR, NIST, MFA, SRA, and our goal is to help cut through all of that. We help you focus on what actually protects patient information and not just what fills out that checklist. So that's us in a nutshell. We take the complex, make it clear without making compliance feel like another full-time job. Now, with that context, let's talk about what we're going to be covering today, because there's a lot happening in HIPAA right now that most people don't even realize. Okay, so here's where we're headed today. We're going to start by talking about why HIPAA still matters, because even though the rule's been around since the 90s, the way it applies today looks totally different. Then we'll move on to some core requirements, the things that every organization must have in place to be compliant. This is a no gray area section. This is the stuff that the OCR always looks for first. From there, we'll look at what's changing, including updates to the security rule, enforcement priorities, and what the 2025-2026 landscape is starting to look like. We'll also talk about common misconceptions, those areas where, good organizations still trip up, not because they don't care, but because HIPAA can be, a little vague on purpose. And finally, we'll end with how to build on continuous compliance. So that would mean, what compliance actually fits day-to-day operations instead of something that you only think about once a year when you have to do your security risk assessment. So whether you're here to tighten your compliance program, or you're trying to prep for your next security risk assessment, or just understand what good looks like for HIPAA today, you're in the right place. So let's talk about why HIPAA still matters. HIPAA was first introduced back in the 90s, and it was mainly to protect paper records and fax machines, not cloud storage, mobile apps, or AI tools analyzing your EHR data. Fast forward to today, healthcare is completely digital. There are risks everywhere, and everyone is moving at a really fast pace. I know some organizations are still working on paper and transitioning to electronic patient records. So I know this is still a hybrid environment, but it's not to the same point where all patient information is locked in a file cabinet. It's also stored, transmitted, and synced across dozens of systems like EHRs, billing platforms, patient portals, and even texting tools. And that's why HIPAA matters more now than ever before. These risks didn't go away, but they've multiplied. We've got phishing attacks, data sharing between apps, wearable health tech, telehealth, and vendors connecting in ways that didn't even exist when HIPAA was written. Now, the good news is that HIPAA isn't outdated. It's still pretty flexible. It doesn't tell you how to secure information, but it tells you to think through the risks and put personal and reasonable safeguards in place. And that's what keeps it relevant and it's able to adapt. Now, here's the thing about compliance. It isn't just about avoiding penalties, but it's about trust, and patients share the most personal information with you, whether it's their diagnosis, medications, or even social and family details. And when they trust that that information is safe, they're more open, they're more engaged, and they're more likely to follow through with care. So all in all, yes, HIPAA still matters. It's still our foundation for privacy, security, and ethical care in a digital world. And as you'll see throughout today's session, the organizations that do this aren't just following that list, but they're building trust and preventing breaches and protecting their reputation all at the same time. We hear this often out in the field. Everyone wears many hats. So let's try and make this a little easier for you. So now that we've grounded ourselves in the why, let's tackle some of the biggest misconceptions about HIPAA that still confuse people today. So here's some of the biggest myths. A lot of times I hear this out in the field, and I understand the background context of where that comes from, but these are still things that people confidently say in meetings that sound true but aren't quite true. So first myth, we're too small to get audited. Actually, smaller organizations are getting more attention now and not less. The OCR knows that large hospitals usually have compliance departments, but small practices often have gaps. And so it's no longer, prevalent that small practices get off easy. They're starting to look at them more and more with the expectation that they are keeping up to speed with what's actually required. So no matter the size, documentation, all in all, is going to be your best defense. Myth number 2, encryption is optional. Technically true today, but not for long. So the security rule calls encryption addressable, which means you better have a good reason not to. And under the upcoming security rule updates, encryption and MFA will move from optional to required. And this one's personally one of my favorites. HIPAA is IT's responsibility. This is not even close to being true. If that were true, every compliance officer could take a long vacation and let the IT team handle it. In reality, HIPAA issues start with people and processes, not just with servers and software. It builds those locks. IT builds those locks, but compliance makes sure that people have the right keys. And last, but certainly not least, we did our security risk analysis last year, so we're covered. That's like saying, I went to the dentist in 2023, so I don't need to brush anymore. The security rule requires ongoing review and updates whenever your systems, vendors, or workflows change. And they don't want to just see a report, but they want to see progress year over year. So if you hear any of these myths floating around your organization, you now have permission to politely say, actually, that's not quite how HIPAA works. So now that we've cleared up some of these common myths, I'm going to move to what HIPAA actually requires. And these are the non-negotiables that every covered entity needs to have in place. So now that we busted those myths, let's look at how HIPAA is actually structured. Because when you really break it down, HIPAA isn't thousands of disconnected requirements, but it's 3 core rules: privacy, security, and breach notification, with everything else branching from those guardrails. So let's start with the privacy rule. This is the foundation. It sets the boundaries for how patient information can be used or shared. It defines patient rights, giving them control over their own information, and enforces that minimum necessary principle, meaning you only use or share what's needed for your job and absolutely nothing more. Next, we have the security rule, and this is the how. So this covers electronic PHI, and it also defines safeguards that keep information protected. So these would be things like passwords, access control, encryption, and physical security. If the privacy rule says protect the data, security rule says here's how we actually do it. The third piece is the breach notification rule. This one activates if something goes wrong: a lost laptop, a phishing email, unauthorized access. So this requires investigation, documentation, and sometimes notification to parents, patients, and the OCR. So it's not really meant to be punishment, but it's about transparency, and that's one of the first things that regulators will look for after an incident. Now you'll notice on the slide, under the 3 main rules, there's surrounded by a box that says everything else. That's the that's the part that most people get lost in. So these are all the policies, training, vendor oversight, risk analysis, and sanction procedures, along with technical procedures. So this is all of these other tasks that need to get done under those 3 rules. And that's all HIPAA too. So it exists to support those 3 guardrails, and it really protects patient information from all angles. It really defines what's allowed in privacy. Security keeps it safe. And then breach notification makes sure that you're accountable when things don't go as planned. Everything else is the documentation, audit, policies, procedures that exist to keep you between those guardrails. So let's talk about what this looks like in practice. HIPAA's requirements aren't mysterious. They come down to a few core expectations that apply to every covered entity and business associate. So first, you need a current documented security risk analysis. Not one from a few years ago, but one that reflects your systems and workflows today. That assessment should identify risks, and you should be able to show how you're addressing them. From there, HIPAA expects a clear plan for managing those risks, meaning you're assigning responsibility, tracking progress, and verifying that fixes actually happen. Next, you'll also need policies and procedures that match reality. If your policy says one thing and your staff does the other, the OCR will notice. Every workforce member must complete training annually, not just when they're hired, but at least once a year and anytime any major changes occur. And with that, as with everything in HIPAA, it has to be documented. And finally, you're going to need to manage your vendors. Anyone that handles or has access to protected health information must have a business associate agreement and meet the same security standards that you do. If there's a theme here, it's documentation. The OCR doesn't expect every entity to be perfect, but they expect visibility. You don't have to have 0 risk. You just have to show that you know your risks, you're addressing them, and you can prove it. So now let's look at what the OCR is actually zeroing in on during investigations and audits, because their focus areas tell us exactly where compliance efforts should go. So, some of the things that the OCR is focusing on now is looking at certain patterns that show up in their enforcement actions, and they're surprisingly consistent. These same issues that caused trouble 5 years ago are still driving most investigations today. At the top of the list are incomplete or outdated security risk analysis. The OCR still finds organizations using templates that miss key systems or fail to include cloud vendors, mobile devices, or new technology. A risk analysis is supposed to be the foundation of your entire program, and if that's missing or outdated, it's a guaranteed red flag that they're going to start looking into. Next up is late breach reporting. So HIPAA gives you up to 60 days to report, but the OCR has made it clear that a limit, it shows that 60 days, but it's not a goal. Waiting until day 59 does not look good. They expect prompt reporting and clear internal processes for identifying and escalating incidents. Another big one is right of access complaints. So this would happen if patients requesting their medical records continue to drive more enforcement than almost anything else. Most cases aren't about malicious intent. People aren't out there to purposely do something wrong or be bad, but it's about delays in miscommunication or staff not knowing the correct processes. And finally, vendor oversight. So business associates have been behind some of the largest breaches in the past recent years. The OCR expects covered entities to actively monitor them, not just have a BAA contract filed away on your shared drive and you put it there and forget it. So when you think about where to focus your compliance energy, it's really important to focus it in those 4 areas. And if you can confidently say your organization's risk analysis, reporting, access requests, and vendor management are up to date and documented, you're already ahead of all of your colleagues out in the field. And, realistically, I think the OCR director, Melanie Fontes Rayner, put it perfectly. A HIPAA compliant risk analysis isn't just a legal requirement, but it's really the foundation of cybersecurity. So let's talk about where HIPAA is heading. So because the landscape is changing so fast, there are updates that the OCR is trying to implement. We've been hearing about updates to the security rule for years, and now finally it's on the horizon. Earlier, in 2023, they released the security rule, the NPRM, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and it's the first major update to happen in nearly 20 years. So what does that mean for you? It means HIPAA's finally catching up with all the modern technology, and the security rule will emphasize encryption and MFA to required, so not just as addressable. Stronger vendor oversight and documentation of business associate management, ongoing risk management instead of a one-time annual review, and clear expectations for leadership accountability, meaning senior management will be explicitly responsible for data protection outcomes. We're also seeing a huge shift in AI and data privacy guidance. The OCR and the FTC are both working on new frameworks that address AI use in healthcare, especially around transparency, de-identification, and PHI input restrictions. If an AI tool processes, predicts, or stores protected health information, it's automatically subject to HIPAA. So it's one of those moments where technology moves first and compliance has to catch up quickly. And finally, the 42 CFR Part 2 updates, which deal with substance use disorder information, are being aligned with HIPAA. This will take place in 2026 and will make data sharing between providers easier while maintaining strict privacy protections for those records. So between the security rule overhaul and AI guidance, along with 42 CFR Part 2 alignment, 2025 and 2026 are shaping up to be the years of really big change. So the main takeaway here is that organizations that already have structured compliance programs won't struggle with these updates. If your security risk analysis and vendor oversight and documentation are solid, adapting to the new rules will just mean tightening a few bolts. If your compliance plan lives in a binder or on a shared folder, you might feel some pressure. So with that, let's break down about what these new requirements will actually look like and prepare for them before they arrive. Okay, so let's look at what the updated security rule actually has changes for. So big picture is this. The new rule is aligning closely with NIST SP 800-66 revision 2, which means that HIPAA will finally be speaking the same language as modern cybersecurity frameworks, which is a really good thing because it gives everyone clear standards to follow and it removes a lot of those gray areas. So here's what's shifting. So I mentioned before, there's encryption and MFA will no longer be considered addressable. So this means that you can't just explain why you don't have them, but you'll be expected to show why, and you'll also be expected to show that you do have those measures in place as well. So this update reflects the reality of modern breaches because over 80% of healthcare incidents actually start with compromised credentials. Next is ongoing risk management. It becomes an explicit expectation. HIPAA already requires an annual security risk analysis, but the rule will emphasize that compliance must be continuous, meaning you're tracking and updating risks throughout the year, not just doing a once-a-year assessment. That is going to be huge. There's also a new focus on leadership accountability. So the proposed updates call for executive level ownership of security outcomes. So if a breach occurs, the OCR won't just look at IT, but they'll look at whether leadership provided adequate resources and oversight for security and privacy programs. They're no longer accepting the I didn't know. Another big change is vendor oversight. So the new rule will reinforce business associates to make sure that you understand that they're an extension of your compliance program, not a separate entity you can outsource risk to. So covered entities will need to show that they verify and monitor those relationships. And finally, there's a documentation standard. So everything from access controls to incident response will need to be written, reviewed, and retained. The OCR wants to see the full story. They want to know what your safeguards are, how you test them, and how you know that they work. And if you're already documenting, your security risk assessment, you're using MFA and encrypting devices along with reviewing vendor access, you're already ahead of the curve. But if you're not, now is the time to start closing those gaps because once this rule is finalized, those addressable excuses are not going to fly anymore and they're going to start cracking down on people. Good news is that none of this should feel new. It's what strong security programs are already doing. These updates just make it official. Now let's look at some practical ways to keep this all organized and the process that we use with clients that helps make compliance continuous instead of reactive. Okay, so with all these requirements and updates, how do you actually keep compliance moving without feeling overwhelmed? Well, we use simple framework for this, and it goes under assess, assign, act, and audit. It's how we help organizations turn compliance into a cycle that's continuous instead of chaotic. So let's break this down. The first step is assess. This is where you take the security risk analysis and you really use it. This analysis identifies what's working and what's not and where your vulnerabilities are. So you're not just trying to complete all the remediation items right away and hope that it addresses everything. It's really taking a look at your day-to-day processes and seeing what can happen to make your HIPAA compliance program better and stronger, especially over time. It's really understanding your environment and setting priorities. Next is assign. So this is every risk or task needs an owner. The biggest compliance failure that we see is when things isn't just what things aren't getting done, but it's that no one knows who was supposed to do them. A lot of times it's, oh, this department is responsible for doing it. Oh, I thought, so-and-so was supposed to conduct these assessments or audits. So it's really making sure that you understand who needs to get what type of task done and who's overseeing different processes. So if you assign clear responsibility and realistic timelines, everyone knows what their lane is, and accountability will start flowing naturally. Then comes act. So this is where the rubber meets the road. Implementing fixes, updating policies, and retraining staff or securing devices is where this comes into play. The key is progress and not perfection. The OCR does not expect you to eliminate every risk overnight. They expect to see that you're moving in the right direction and you're documenting all the steps. And please make sure that, as you're going through these items, if you need additional resources or help, that you're reaching out to your compliance team and seeing what can be done to help your overall HIPAA compliance program, because that's the first step, is that identification process, and then how do you make it happen every day. The last piece is going to be audit. I know people really don't like that word, but it is so integral in this process. This is where you circle back and you verify, did that remediation actually work? And are people actually using the new procedures that are put into place? And doing these quick internal audits or review really closes the loop and keeps your compliance plan current. And something that I often say with clients is, the OCR, when they're conducting audits, they're looking at, improvement over time. And they're kind of like the IRS. When you want an exemption, if you don't have documentation, then it never happened. Make sure that you are giving yourselves credit in all the things that you're doing, because all those things do count. And we really just want to help people understand that once you close that gap, it's going to really help make processes a lot smoother. So not that it's, a few quick things, but, when you assess, assign, act, and audit, this is repeatable. It keeps your program alive all year long. And when you apply this mindset, not just for your security risk analysis, but for training, policies, and vendor reviews, compliance really becomes much easier to maintain. So if you stop reacting and you start managing, things will become much easier. Now, even with good processes in place, there's still a few areas that tend to trip people up. So let's look at the most common gaps that we see across organizations. Now, with even strong framework in place, every organization has a few blind spots. It's just life and it's reality, and things can quietly fall through the cracks. We see patterns everywhere, and honestly, most of them are really easy to fix once you see them. One of the most common things that we see is that policies don't quite match all reality. So maybe your policy says change passwords every 90 days, but everyone knows that hasn't actually happened since 2018. Or that your incident response policy lists a staff member who retired 5 years ago. It's small things like that that create really big compliance gaps. But once you have that in place, it makes it a lot easier to hit the number one icon here. So security risk analysis. So if your security risk analysis are not complete, it really creates large gaps in your HIPAA compliance program. Sometimes they only include, the EHR information or skip over email or mobile devices or third-party applications. But if the OCR can find PHI in those systems, they'll expect to see them in your risk analysis too. Then there's vendor oversight. I know we've talked about this a little bit, but a lot of organizations have BAAs in place, but never review the vendor again after signing. Remember, HIPAA requires that ongoing oversight, not just a set it and forget it contract. So if your vendor changes how they store or access data, that affects your risk too. Some common things that I've seen out in the field is, those evergreen contracts, those contracts that never expire. And, these are handy so you don't have to necessarily send out notifications year over year, but there is hidden dangers in evergreen contracts. You'll want to make sure that as methods change either within your organization, the vendor's organization, or with regulations, that the contract meets the requirements. So even with evergreen contracts, it's really important to review those annually and reach out if there needs to be a revision. The BAA is meant to be a mutual protection for both sides. So it's in both interests to make sure that that is up to date. And there's also training gaps. So we see organizations that do annual training. That's the same PowerPoint that they've used for 5 years in a row. Training should evolve, as systems do. And once that training is completed, it's important to make sure that that documentation is kept, and also along with all of your security risk analysis documentation on any adjustments to your HIPAA compliance program and any fixes are documented. I often suggest that, clients have a HIPAA folder if they don't have already one in place, and maybe some subfolders that include audits, assessments, inventories, so everything is in one place. So if something ever does happen and you have to go into emergency mode, or you have to activate your business continuity plan because an incident has happened, you'll want to make sure that you have this information accessible and ready, so that way if you need to use it or you have to provide it to regulatory agencies, that you have it in your grasp, and it just makes things a little less chaotic. And people who forget these things, they're not bad organizations. Everyone's just really busy, and they're also human. So it's just key to keep your findings visible and moving. And, speaking of progress, one of the best ways to strengthen compliance and build muscle memory across the team is through training and tabletop exercises. So let's talk about that. So I know everybody here must love training. Everyone loves to sit down and conduct training annually and go through lots of different meetings. I can hear giggles and sarcasm through the muted audience, but it's really important that we talk about this. So I know the word in itself can make people groan, but here's the truth. Training doesn't have to be long or complicated or painful to be effective. In fact, the best HIPAA programs are the ones that make training short, relevant, and consistent. HIPAA requires every workforce member to be trained and not just once they're hired, but whenever there's new risks, system changes, or updated policies. So if your organization rolls out a new EHR feature or adds AI into a workflow, that's a trainable moment. The key is to keep it practical so you don't need to lecture people on regulatory citations. You just need to connect it to their day-to-day rules. So, for example, here's how to know if your email is safe to open, or here's what to do if you lose a device, or here's who to call if something doesn't look right. And some of the best ways to reinforce this is through tabletop exercises. So these are short, scenario-based discussions where you walk through what would happen in a real situation, like a ransomware attack or system outage, which I'll knock on wood that doesn't happen to any of you out there. But it's not about testing people, but it's really practicing that response before it's needed, so everyone knows what to do in those situations. And when you do this regularly, even once or twice a year, it turns compliance into second nature. Instead of having staff stop and freezing up in emergencies, because if they've already trained in this, they already know what to do. They can focus on what they need to do for day-to-day procedures, and you can focus on getting things back online. And, through regular training and, regular training, including that annual training and ongoing training, tabletop exercises, it really helps bring that HIPAA compliance culture into perspective. And speaking of partners that are in culture, let's talk a little bit more about business associates, because there is quite a big focus on that. They're part of your HIPAA compliance program too, whether they realize it or not. So I've seen many IT departments. I love many of the IT departments that I meet. I don't necessarily think that people are eating and rollerblading by, but I have seen some funny departments. These business associates that you hire to help your organization are your partners. So, they also share risk with you, and it doesn't just stop at the firewall level. If a third party stores, transmits, or even accesses PHI on your behalf, you're both responsible for keeping that data secure. So, as many of you know, this starts with the Business Associate Agreement, also known as the BAA, and it's your legal safeguard. But it's not just enough to have it on file, but you also need to perform due diligence before engagement and make sure that their practices align with yours. And, this also makes sure that, that they have a HIPAA compliance program in place and they know what to do in an emergency, not just sign the contract because they want to have that ongoing engagement and collect that check. So, it really doesn't end once the contract gets signed. HIPAA expects ongoing oversight. So that means checking in, reviewing reports, and confirming that vendors are following through on their security commitments. If they merge, get acquired, or change leadership, that can change their risk profile too, and you need to know that, and you have a right to know that. And this ranges from incident response, and your vendors should be a part of your plan as well. If they experience a breach, your clock for reporting starts ticking the moment that you're notified. And that's why coordination and clear expectations are very, very critical. And finally, just make sure everything is documented. I'll probably say this 1,000 times more during this segment. The risk reviews, the communication, and any follow-up actions, it's important to have that documentation trail. Those records prove that you're managing third-party risk proactively and not just reactively. And at the day, vendor compliance is your compliance. It's important to make sure that they're upholding the same standards that you do. And the OCR is looking to see that you are monitoring them and they're not just flying under the radar. there has been an increase in the OCR, observing business associate practices. And a lot of the business associates that we talked to today do have HIPAA compliance program that they're involved in, or they conduct services with us. And we can tell that they take compliance very seriously. So it's worth having that extra conversation with them and open up communication and dialogue with them. Okay, so here is our hottest topic. Let's talk about AI. It's the newest member to the compliance conversation, and AI is showing up everywhere right now. And there's so many different operations popping up to be the first and best for everything that you do day to day. And it ranges anywhere from clinical documentation assistance to chatbots, scheduling tools, and data analytics platforms. And while AI can make things faster and more efficient, it also introduces new privacy and security risks that HIPAA absolutely applies to. So here's a rule of thumb. If AI touches, stores, or processes any protected health information, even indirectly, it falls under HIPAA. So that means it needs to be a part of your security risk analysis. It also needs to be covered by a business associate agreement if it's a third-party tool, and it needs to have limited access to the minimum necessary data. We've already seen some real-world problems in this space where some organizations accidentally uploaded PHI onto public AI tools, things like open source ChatGPT, without realizing that the prompts can be stored on their external servers. Others have integrated unapproved AI features into their EHRs or patient communication platforms, accidentally exposing data that they didn't even mean to share. And the message here is not don't use AI, but just use it responsibly. And make sure that any AI system that you're using has been reviewed, approved, and configured to protect patient data. If you're not sure whether a tool is approved or not, it's just better to ask before you use it. And, something that I've been mentioning with clients as well, if there is an AI tool that is going to help you and help with your day-to-day processes, your IT team and your compliance team are there to help not only keep HIPAA compliance on the forefront, but also make sure that workflows are working properly. And so please bring that to their attention if there's a tool that can help so they can properly investigate and vet it for you. Please do not use them until it is properly released and they're able to go through their own internal audit and onboarding process. AI can be the greatest asset or your biggest enemy. And like any technology, it's only as safe as the boundaries that you set around it. So if it's new, or if it connects to data, or if it's smart, it deserves a second look from your compliance or IT department. And if you ever catch yourself wondering, can I put this patient information into the tool? The answer is probably no, or at least until compliance says yes. So now that we've talked about AI and emerging risks, let's start wrapping things up a little bit by looking at how your compliance efforts can keep going all year long and not just during audit season. So let's talk about what I like to call the hustle, because that's what continuous compliance really comes down to. HIPAA isn't a one and done project or something that you do only when assessment season rolls around, but it's part of the day-to-day grind, the small, consistent actions that keep organizations moving in the right direction. The hustle means that your team isn't waiting for compliance season, but you're living it all year long. It's reviewing vendor access before something breaks, catching that suspicious email before it's a breach, updating policies before they're outdated, and those quiet routine check-ins that no one celebrates, but that keep your system secure and your data protected. Continuous compliance is about rhythm, not reaction. And when you keep that rhythm, that assess, assign, act, and audit, the whole team gets stronger. Compliance stops being a scramble and starts being a reflex, and that's really what you want. And the best part of that is that it's contagious. When leaders model it, staff start picking it up. And when IT communicates it, compliance builds around it. And when people understand why, they hustle because they care, not just because a document says so. And here's the truth, because OCR doesn't accept perfection, they don't expect everyone to shell out hundreds of thousands of dollars for the best system and to be 100% perfect and expect that all employees know what to do in every single situation possible. But they want to see momentum, that you're learning, adapting, and showing that visible progress. And if you're documenting your work, reviewing risks, and acting when things change, that's the hustle. That's compliance in motion. So whether you're updating policy, logging, access, or double checking a vendor, every small action counts, and make sure that you're giving yourself credit for it. And that's how you stay ready and not reactive. And that's how compliance becomes part of your culture instead of another list that you have to maintain. So at the end of the day, the hustle is what keeps patient trust alive. And it's really the heart of compliance. And that's protecting people by showing up for the process every single day. So let's wrap up with a few final takeaways before we close things out.
For the Q&A.
So after this talk about rules, risks, and the hustle, this is where it really lands. Keep it moving. HIPAA just isn't about systems and safeguards, but it's about people. So every time you handle patient information, answer a privacy question, or pause to double check before sharing, that's the work that keeps care safe and keeps trust intact. So keep it moving means that you're staying engaged and that you are aware that this compliance is in motion. And because privacy and security doesn't live in a binder, it's live in the how we show up every day. The real success of compliance program isn't measured by how many policies that you have, but it's how you naturally protect people and their information without even thinking twice. And that's when you know the culture is working. So whether you're in IT, admin, clinical care, or leadership, it's really important that you keep the momentum going and stay curious and stay proactive and stay a part of that solution. And when you do that, HIPAA becomes more than a requirement, but it becomes who you are as an organization. And that is how you keep it going. And, when you turn compliance from a task into a legacy, it really protects every patient every day.
All right.
Perfect. So, as we go through and we start moving towards the Q&A section, I just wanted to give you a couple takeaways here. First, we have regulatory change. It's here. Don't wait to adapt. The updates that we talked about today are already shaping the next few years, and organizations need to stay ready and to make sure that you're not reacting, but you're anticipating those changes. Second, you'll need documentation. It's going to be your best defense. If you can show your work, the policies, the assessments, and the follow-ups, you're already halfway there. Third, follow the 4-step method that assess, assign, act, and audit. That rhythm keeps compliance alive year-round, and it's simple, repeatable, and works no matter the size of your organization. Fourth, most violations come from misunderstanding and not neglect. So people want to do the right thing. They just don't always know what it looks like. And that's why training and awareness matters so much. So close the gap between intent and action. And finally, compliance is culture, and culture drives trust. The more your team understands the why, the more naturally they'll protect patient information in doing everything. That turns compliance into a shared responsibility, and that's where that security really starts. So just quick food for thought. HIPAA compliance is a continuous, proactive process that requires consistent documentation, training, and vendor oversight. And by following a proven security risk analysis and remediation approach, healthcare organizations can navigate evolving regulatory landscapes and build that culture of security and drive patient trust. All right, so let's take a few minutes for some thoughts or some questions.